Welcome to the second in our series of webinars focused on advertising, brands, copyright and designs. My name's John Coldham and I'm the UK Head of Brands and Designs at Gowling. Last month's webinar was on advertising in the current environment, from the growth of digital marketing through to coping with the pandemic. If you missed it, we'll include a link to it in our follow-up email. As last time, I'm sorry that we can't offer you any lunch or coffee and that we won't be giving you a view of the Thames, although I suppose we could have done it as our background picture. You never know, next year we might be coming out blinking into the sunlight, but in the meantime we're going to continue with this webinar series, and this month we are focusing on brands. We've decided to take a slightly different approach to this year's event. Instead of giving you an update on a key case, which may or may not affect your day-to-day life, we've decided to discuss various issues of the day affecting brands, and we hope that you find it useful. Particularly because we're using more of a discursive format for today's webinar, we'd love more than ever to get your input into the event. There are so many different types of businesses, large and small, who've signed up to today's event, and it would be great to hear your perspectives on the issues that we're talking about. To get involved, please provide your comments and questions as we go along using the Q&A box, which should, Zoom allowing, be at the bottom of your screen. We'll either try and cover the point as we go along or at the end, when we've allowed some time for questions. We may not be able to get to every question and or comment that we receive, and if we don't get to yours, it's nothing personal, but we'll get in touch with you directly afterwards. We are recording this webinar, and if you'd like to send a link afterwards to any colleagues who might like to see it, then please feel free to do so and we'll provide it to you on the email. Finally, I should just mention that at the end, a little feedback form should pop up. I'd be very grateful if you could fill that in, as we really do take account of all comments, good and bad, to help us tailor future events to what you would actually like to hear about. So let's get started as we mean to go on. The word disruption has been a cliche for some time, but we are certainly living in an era of change. Social change tends to take a long time, but some of the more positive things we've seen from this crazy year are that social change is in some ways moving more quickly than might otherwise have been the case. Every business has a brand, and how brands align themselves with change is a question that they should each be asking themselves. Brands may be tempted to ignore it, but that should be a positive decision that's taken. And there are many good reasons to respond to social change. To discuss this issue with me, I'm pleased to welcome Kate Swaine, who is the co-head of our global intellectual property practice, and she advises companies large and small on brands issues, including this. So Kate, I'll just turn the slides off for a moment so we can see you better. How do you see brands responding to social change?
Well, first of all, hello everybody. Welcome to my home. I think if we take a step back for a moment, so consumers are drawn to brands for a number of reasons, but increasingly over the last few years we've seen that some of those key reasons are around authenticity, they're around values, they're around genuineness, and brand owners know this. They know that a name or a logo is so much more than that. That if they're going to engender and they're going to retain brand loyalty, then they have to really identify with their consumers. And they spend vast amounts of money, John, as you and I both know, on this. So whether it's consumer focus groups, whether it's looking at the tone of their communications, whether it's investing in associations between celebrities and brands. And I mean, for those of you that did tune in and listen to Dan Smith and Kate Hawkins talking on this subject, you know, social media and influencers is a huge issue for brands these days. And all of it's about the underlying message, you know, what are the values of the brand and how are they going to be conveyed? So that when the consumer buys an item or they buy a service, they're doing it in the knowledge this is something that makes them feel good, or it's something they identify with, it's something that shares their values or that they share the associations. And if you get it right, then it can really be brand enhancing. If you get it wrong, it can be a complete disaster. And the current political and social climate, I think, is presenting a real challenge actually to brands. You know, the conversations around really important issues, you know, race, gender, sexuality, the environment, culture. These are issues that are really important to consumers. So they are really important to brands. But the problem is that there are huge divergences around those views. But we only need to look at the events of the last week or two. As you know, John, I seem to have had CNN playing in my house 24/7 now for about 2 weeks. I have to switch it off at some point. But if you're an in-house brands team, or your in-house counsel, and your marketing team are coming to you and they're saying, look, we want to take a stand on an issue, this is the campaign we want to do, you need to decide whether or not your brand is going to be part of that conversation, and if so, how. The starting point, really, because this is almost, it's a form of clearance you're having to do, it's a risk assessment that you are having to do as in-house counsel. So you have to start by asking questions. Who are your consumers? What are the values associated with your brand? Are the issues important to your consumers? Are they ones that resonate or impact on the values imbued in your brand? Can the brand actually afford to stay neutral? So if the issue has no relevance at all to your brand or to its consumers, there is a real risk that any stance you take will it will look false, it will look opportunist, and at a time when consumers are looking for genuine engagement, that's not going to work well. So take, for example, a manufacturer of frozen lasagna. A manufacturer of frozen lasagna taking a stance on body image is not going to ring true. But one that takes a position on the recyclability of packaging is. There's a relevance there, there's a resonance. And actually, environment and climate is a really good example where I think many brands simply can't risk not being engaged. Greta Thunberg and other very prominent individuals have galvanized this debate, and consumers, particularly young consumers, are asking of brands, what are you doing? And I notice I've got 2 teenagers in my house, and the stance on climate issues of the brands they buy from is a key factor in their buying decisions. They are asking, how much packaging do you use? Is it recyclable? What's the company's sustainability policy? So on an issue like that, a brand has to take it very seriously and think, well, can we afford not to get engaged? But I think one of the best ways actually to look at what works and what doesn't work is to take some examples, John. So I know we've got a couple of slides to demonstrate.
Go. There you go.
Right, super, thank you. So here we've got Colin Kaepernick, and I think most of you should be very familiar with this. This one really hit the news big time. So here Nike's message was, believe in something even if it means sacrificing everything. And this, of course, all came back to Colin Kaepernick taking the knee during the national anthem in protest at police brutality against Black Americans. Now, initially, Nike's share price dropped by 2% after this campaign was launched, but they maintained their stance, and the share price not only recovered, but it increased. And actually, jerseys bearing Kaepernick's name are one of the top selling products that Nike has ever had. So despite criticisms from some quarters, and many of us will have seen people cutting Nike logos out of socks and things online, the consensus was overwhelmingly that this campaign was a success and it was brand enhancing. Apart from the fact that they're very powerful images, it was also the feeling that it resonated as well with many of the messages that Nike had given in the past around resilience, around determination, sport, all of those people felt interplayed well. Another example, I think we've got this on the slide as well, is Dove's campaign, Project #ShowUs. So this is, it's an initiative that was launched in partnership with Getty Images and Girl Gaze. And the project #ShowUs Hub is on Getty's platform. It features thousands of photographs taken by women, showing women of all types. And this was in response to reports and surveys around how women believe they are perceived and how women feel they are portrayed. And the studies included issues such as, 70% of women don't feel represented by advertisements. And Dove really embraced this. And this particular campaign, again, huge success, a lot of really positive coverage, because it was felt, again, it chimed really well with their consumers. It fitted in with the messages they've been giving in other campaigns, and the inclusivity in the current environment really worked well, the message. Another example would be something like Aldi's plastic reduction campaign. Now, I know lots of food manufacturers, supermarkets have done this, but Aldi's has done particularly well because they have backed up things with very specific commitments and then updates on those. They've shown that they are committed not only to the general cause but to really specific goals, and that's gone well. Airbnb, John, is another one that I think stands out. They did #WeAccept. So this was in response to some controversial immigration decisions in the US, and it actually aired at the Super Bowl, which immediately kind of makes you think, well, hang on a minute, isn't that I mean, the Super Bowl is in the US, you know, the biggest advertising opportunity and the most expensive. So whilst it immediately feels very opportunistic, they backed it with very clear commitments. So they said that they would provide short-term housing for 100,000 refugees, disaster survivors, displaced people, and that they would also commit to donate $4 million to the International Rescue Committee over the next 4 years. So what was a very materialistic, huge marketing event, though, was they backed it up with real social resonance behind what they were trying to do. And as a result, it gave them fantastic publicity, very brand enhancing. But I know it's as useful to look at where it hasn't worked as where it has. And I know you and I have talked about this next ad quite a bit, and it's probably the one that people think of in terms of what not to do. It's the Pepsi one. So for those of you who didn't see this, and it was pulled quite quickly, but you can see it on YouTube. This ad showed lots of happy, attractive young people holding protest signs with the police watching on, police looking very stern. A police officer then accepts a can of Pepsi from Kendall Jenner, and immediately everybody cheers. The crowd is happy, the police all start smiling, all is well with the world. Well, the backlash was remarkable. So people felt it trivialized Black Lives Matters, but they also felt that it trivialized protest generally, that, you know, there's this spirit that people endured, that people were trying to overcome something, and the idea that these very important issues could be overcome by a can of Pepsi, it did not go down well. And Pepsi did the right thing, and they withdrew it. Another example, actually, which you wouldn't think would be contentious many years ago, but it is now, is the use of pink. So pink is associated, certainly in my mind, Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and that use it's applauded, it's recognized, fantastic. But efforts that have been made to rebadge things pink in order to associate with diversity have not gone down so well. So one example would be Brewdog. It renamed its Punk IPA Pink IPA, and Brewdog is known for playing with its brand, doing different things, trying to be very satirical, but this did not hit the mark. So and Brewdog quickly recognized it. The response was that people felt that it was actually not doing what it was intended to do, which Brewdog said was to highlight people who patronized and used gender stereotypes. In effect, people thought that Brewdog were being patronizing and using a gender stereotype. And the same goes for the Labour Party. Those of you remember the pink bus and Harriet Harman. They had the pink bus, woman to woman, having conversations around the kitchen table was the whole campaign. It just didn't go down well at all. There was no irony in it. It just didn't hit at all. Lush was one where they put a campaign in their windows about the police inquiry into the use of undercover officers. There was a huge backlash there, obviously from the police, but also there's a great deal of public reaction on that one from consumers feeling it just wasn't appropriate for Lush, a cosmetics company, to be taking the particular stance it did, but also to be voicing a view on that particular issue. The connection between the brand and the issue simply wasn't there. So it teaches us a lot around what we should and we shouldn't do. Thinking about, I suppose, practical takeaways for some of our audience about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. I think one of the key things is know your audience, know your consumers, Be aware of your actions, past and present. So you may in the present be wanting to take a particular stance and have very strong views about that, and that's great. But do your past actions, are they consistent with that? Do they resonate with that? If they don't, that's not necessarily an issue. You can take a stance. You can make clear that this is a new chapter for the brand, that the brand is adopting a different, it's embracing the future. It's far better to do that than to have somebody else call you out about your past. So be clear, and if you get it wrong, admit it. Be quick to admit it. A lot of those brands where they did make mistakes that I talked about, they've been really quick to admit it, pull back, learn from it, and acknowledge it. Making excuses, whether you agree or not with the consumer perception you've created, isn't going to work. And know that a successful engagement can actually really become part of the brand itself. And I was trying to think of a good example of this. And I was thinking Ren Skincare is a good example here. So they've always kind of emphasized clean skin, the fact that they try and minimize the chemicals in their products, but they've taken that a step further in terms of the environment. So now it's clean to skin, clean to planet. They've partnered with Surfers Against Sewage, Plastic Patrol, made a pledge for zero waste. It's become absolutely central to their brand identity and who they are, and has been very successful. I think the final point I'd make is be careful with humour, because one person's humour is another person's offence. And yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, particularly you, John. I was going to say that, but anyway. But the point is that what you may recognise as irony or satire is not necessarily going to be recognised by your audience. It might be recognised by some, but it's not necessarily going to be picked up. And the voice that comes back saying that isn't funny has a platform, because it's got social media. So you have got to be very cautious about how you treat particularly some really serious social issues. But I don't think this trend is going away. I don't think brands can avoid engaging on a lot of these issues. And looking at the news these days, I think there's a lot more to come.
Thanks, Kay. We've actually had a question which we might jump in with now, as it's relevant to this section. Mm-hmm. It's regarding the question of learning when you might have got it wrong and pulling back from that. The question is it not worth making a stance if it's what you believe in, and where is the line? Looking at the Nike example, as opposed to perhaps some of the others. And I noticed actually, for example, that the Lush campaign, they did actually stick with that, in that it is still all over their website.
They put it back up. Yeah, they did.
How do you know when to pull back, because you believe in it but it's damaging your brand, and when not?
I think there is a point, and actually the Nike one is a really good example of that. That they decided, they made a commitment to stick with it, and actually I think had they pulled it, I think that would have been far more damaging for them as a brand than it would sticking with it. Each one is going to turn on the surrounding circumstances, but this is, and also your particular consumers, the general environment at the time. But I think it's why it's so important that you are considering the tone, and that you're considering the clarity as well of the message. I think if you're going to stand by what you're saying, it needs to be pretty unambiguous. It needs to be very clear. I think that the reason that some of these stances haven't worked is that they've tried to be a little bit too clever, or a little bit wishy-washy, or they've tried to hedge their bets almost. I think if it's something that is truly important to your brand, then you have to stand by it, albeit recognizing that there could be financial consequences. I think Nike absolutely recognized there could be a financial consequence. They were prepared for that, and they decided this was the right thing for their business to do.
I think probably one answer to this might be, it depends whether you're jumping on a bandwagon or whether it's something you truly believe in. So the question was prefaced around it being something you truly believe in, which I would like to think lots of brands, they do genuinely believe it, but unfortunately, sadly, not in every case. Sometimes it's just a way they think of making a quick buck, and of course that isn't the way to approach this at all.
Absolutely, I think you're right, John. It goes back to right at the beginning when we were talking about as well what consumers want, that genuineness, that authenticity, the transparency. If you can't take the stance with all of those elements imbued in what you're doing, then I think you have to question, well, why are you doing it?
Yeah. We better move on because I'm conscious of time. Now, I opened this webinar talking about change, and of course I mentioned that this year has been particularly notable for its change, and perhaps maybe even unsettling for many. It's probably fair to say that almost every single person on the planet has been disrupted by the pandemic this year, which is probably the definition of change. This presents similar but perhaps also very particular challenges for brands. How have you seen this particular issue affect the strategies that brands have been taking?
It's been really interesting, actually. I think one of the points which is interesting, in a time when we are we're very polarized as a world, what you've seen is, in terms of the brands, is them actually taking a very unifying, empathetic approach to the advertising campaigns. And I have to say, I think a lot of them have landed really well. So some brands have utilized this environment to really promote their values as a company, around their positions as an employee, as an employer, and around their empathy for their employees, their responsiveness. So you've seen a lot of, particularly Silicon Valley, there's kind of everybody can work from home forever if they want to. You've seen people talking about very openly about how they've adapted their working environments. Look, even us, in our own homes today, doing a webinar, we've all had to change, and I think a lot of companies have, embraced that and made it part of who they are. I think we all have to do that. I think also support. Many brands have used it as a platform to raise money or provide supplies for causes associated with COVID. And done it in a very positive way. I think you had a slide, John, showing just some examples. So M&M, Hush, John Lewis have all manufactured masks where there are donations going to the NHS. We've seen Pernod Ricard, Brewdog, Unilever all adapting their manufacturing lines in order to create hand sanitizer products. We've also seen some incorporate the new normal. I am getting a bit sick of that phrase. I don't know about anybody else. The new normal. Nothing feels normal at the moment. But they're adapted the new normal in order to identify with consumers. Nationwide Building Society has used, for instance, real life stories of how people are coping during lockdown, but also people reflecting on what their hopes are for life post pandemic. And those again have landed, really well with consumers. I think that we've also seen, I don't know if maybe it's just me, I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but there's been an increase in the number of adverts about home hair dye kits. So I think some companies have definitely thought, hang on, there's an opportunity here. So if any of you are subscribed to fashion retailer mailing lists, I think every single company has now got a loungewear section in its range, which I find quite amusing. Having said that, I have probably spent more on loungewear and pajamas than I've ever spent in my entire life. Food advertising is definitely more prominent because that's the focus for many of us. That's the focus of our day, sitting in loungewear and eating food, and streaming services so that we can watch Netflix while we're sitting in our loungewear and eating our food. So a lot of brands have responded by seeing that there is an opportunity, and you can also see actually in that reflected actually in share prices and in the success of some businesses. So those that have succeeded, I think, in COVID have been those that, I think strong digital presence has been really important. And you've seen also, I don't know if you've noticed some of the subtleties, but there are some websites you can see have been overhauled and improved during the course of this, particularly in the retail side. Brands that have been able to respond quickly to changing consumer demands. So recognizing that perhaps, consumers aren't going to be buying one product as much, but they are going to be buying another, e.g. back to the loungewear. Adopting the right tone. So the ones that have adopted, reassurance, help, empathy, those have gone down very well. Making it about the consumer, not the brand, and being very genuine and transparent. Where I think people have tripped up a little bit has been where brands have overpromised. So where they've kind of dashed into the hand sanitizers, the masks, the equipment or whatever, and they've had a little bit of backlash because actually what they're promising they can't deliver, or also they've not recognized that once you move into this kind of area, you are into regulated area because you're talking about things that have medical uses. You're making new promises maybe you're not familiar with, and you're not understanding the criteria you need to meet. So there's been a few where there've been missteps and they've not appreciated that. I think the other thing that hasn't worked is where some brands have tried to adjust their brand and it has looked opportunistic. So for example, some brands, they took their name and they separated it in order to emphasize social distancing, or some people adopted a rainbow through things in order to echo the NHS. Well, that was great if you were also donating or supporting the NHS, but it did start to look like it was purely a marketing device rather than engagement and support. So a little bit like the message with the others, it's thinking about how do you engage in a positive way that consumers will see as genuine and not view cynically.
Exactly. That's something that Dan looked at in the previous webinar in terms of advertising campaigns that have hit the market and not. I said at the start of this webinar that some of the change we've seen this year was due to the pandemic, and part of it was perhaps happening anyway, albeit at a slower pace than it is now. Perhaps there's no better example of this than the way that things have moved online, as you were just saying. Every brand is considering how to expand its digital footprint. This raises obviously some particular legal issues, one of them being geo-boundaries. Where does online use constitute infringement in the UK? It's a practical as well as a legal issue for brand owners, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's one, John, we hear a lot. You know, we do get questions from clients a lot. You know, if I do this online, is it going to cause me a problem in this territory or that territory, particularly where a company's looking at clearance, moving into a new territory, or they're trying to navigate their way around a coexistence agreement. And I think this has all been put in the spotlight again quite recently this year by the Merck case. So the original case came out of the use by Merck US of the Merck brand online, and there was a coexistence agreement that was already in place around the use of Merck and another previous Merck entity. And the question was whether or not the use constituted a breach of that agreement, and also did it constitute infringement in the UK. And the Court of Appeal set out the key principles here when considering whether online use constitutes a use in the UK. And I don't know if those of you can remember the Crate and Barrel case from many, many years ago, which was Sir Robin Jacob. But in many ways, the principles are still exactly the same as they were in Crate and Barrel. So, you know, first, is the advertisement or the promotion targeted at UK consumers? Secondly, the fact that something is accessible from the UK does not necessarily mean it's targeted, which often people struggle with. So the fact that you can see the shop window from the UK does not necessarily mean that that shop window is looking to sell goods to the UK. So you need to identify that. Thirdly, you need to look at it from the point of view of the consumer. So would the average UK consumer perceive that this promotion was targeted at them? And finally, you've got to look at all of the relevant circumstances surrounding it. And on that, we had guidance from Mr. Justice Arnold, as he then was, in the Easy Group, Easy Fly case. And he looked at this issue and what factors do we need to be considering? And these tend to be the things, John, that you and I talk to clients about when they're dealing with this. So the telephone numbers on the website, the international dialing codes provided, what do they indicate? Are they the usual codes that the company would use? Are they directed at that territory? The language that's used, the currency that's used, even the domain name, the nature of the domain name. Are there references to international consumers in the alleged targeted country? Now, in that particular case, Mr. Justice Arnold concluded that UK or EU consumers had not been targeted. So the defendant in the case transported goods within Bangladesh. The customers were predominantly Bangladeshi as a result of direct marketing in Bangladesh. English is the dominant language of websites. It's also widely spoken in Bangladesh. There were no UK or EU contact details on the site, and an internet search only produced the defendant's website if you also include Bangladesh in the search. So on the basis of all of that, those relevant circumstances, Mr. Justice Arnold said, no, that this hasn't targeted the UK. So if we bring that back to the Merck decision that we had this year, the case was redetermined in the High Court. So the Court of Appeal gave its guidance, sent it back to the High Court. The High Court had to determine whether Merck US's use of Merck met the necessary requirements for infringement in the UK. So first, it held that the expression using in the course of trade any sign in relation to goods or services in EU trademark law means use for the purpose of distinguishing those goods or services from those of other suppliers. But it also means use such as to create the impression that there is a material link in the course of trade between the goods or services concerned and the undertaking from which those goods or services originate. Now, applying that test and having reviewed Merck's US use on its website, social media, in its email addresses, the court concluded there was indeed a material link between the trademark and the relevant goods and services, so there was infringement. And interestingly, the uses found to be infringing included use of Merck in the email address, so of UK employees, so name @merck.com. That was held to be an infringement. Website pages, social media screenshots, downloadable, all of these things. And all of those elements made that material link, even if, and this was the interesting part, they weren't actually attached to goods or services that were being sold in the UK. So it was a very interesting case.
And obviously, the thing about some of these cases is it's hard, especially a lot of people dialed in today are running busy in-house teams or even just running their businesses. So how do they translate this case to what it means for them? What does it mean on a practical level for brand owners?
Well, first, be careful how you frame coexistence agreements. I have to say, and we often find clients find us overly cautious when it comes to coexistence agreements. There is a reason for that, and that is because I have to say, as lawyers who are dealing with these things on a regular basis, we have come across so many issues and so many problems coming out of coexistence agreements where at the time they've been drafted, everybody said, yeah, that could happen, but it's going to be fine. We'll be all right. Now, call me a cynic, but you know, at the moment that you're doing a deal and you're doing a coexistence agreement and everything feels warm and fluffy and you're going to run through the daisies together, that's great, but things go wrong. And so making sure that at the point that you're drafting that coexistence agreement, in relation to use of a brand, which is going to be territorially divided or divided across types of goods, for example, thinking ahead and thinking, well, what use may I need to make of this brand in the future, whether in relation to the goods or services I want to apply it to or the countries I want to use it in relation to. I'm not doing it right now, but what about in 5 years' time? Looking ahead, what will give me a headache? Because it isn't unusual, it's not unusual for parties to agree to brand coexistence by way of geo boundaries. But it presents particular challenges in the digital space because those geo boundaries are just not so clearly demarcated. So, you know, you've really got to think ahead as to how we're going to be using it and constantly thinking what could go wrong. I'd also be thinking about who and where is your digital presence focused at. So looking at your digital presence as a consumer, is it clear? If you've got potential issues in some territories, have you taken account of that in the presentation of your presence, its technical reach, its capabilities, and what would a consumer believe on accessing your digital presence? That means looking at the detail. Your language, the language is available on the site, the currency, your international delivery options and its policy, your office location, any customer references or quotes, you know, where are those customers based? And looking at what is the implicit message given by your site as to the territories it's looking at. You know, what is your shop window facing essentially?
Yeah, well, speaking of boundaries and borders, we almost managed to make it through this webinar without mentioning another B word, not Biden. I know you're very interested in the US election, but that's for another day. Brexit, I'm afraid, is the one we need to cover. A month and a half until it's a reality. So how should brand owners be preparing for the changes that are coming down the line?
Buy a lot of wine or gin, no. Although that is one option. Actually, on a serious note, the UK IPO has put an awful lot of work into this. So I have to say, huge credit to them, and also to a lot of the industry associations that have been lobbying and working on this, SIPMA and others, that they have done an awful lot. So we actually, compared to the lack of clarity in a lot of areas, I'm proud to say that certainly on trademarks, there is quite a lot of clarity. John, if it's all right with you, I'll just do headlines.
Sure.
We've got a Brexit guide, actually, an IP Brexit guide, which you can get on our website, and I'm sure we'll be sending a link after this.
Yeah, no, we're sending a link with the
great.
This email's going to be long, I'm afraid, after the
Oh, everybody will love it. It's bedtime reading, essential bedtime reading.
help them sleep.
Yeah, you can lie there in your loungewear with your Netflix on and take a flick through our IP Brexit guide. But it's that's got a lot of detail in it, and also covers all the other IP rights too. So if I just give you the headlines really on trademarks and also some practical pointers. So in terms of the headlines, from the 1st of January next year, EU trademarks will no longer protect trademarks in the UK. Under the Withdrawal Act, the UK IPO from the 1st of January is going to create a comparable UK trademark for all rights holders with an existing EU trademark. Existing EU trademarks will continue to protect in EU member states, and there will be no change to national UK trademarks as a result of the UK leaving the EU. So all of that will remain the same. What will happen on the 1st of January is that the UK IPO will automatically create a claimed UK trademark for every registered EU mark. Now, each of those UK marks will be recorded on the UK Trademark Register. It will have the same legal status as if you had applied for and registered under UK law. It's going to keep the original EU trademark filing date, along with any priority or seniority dates, and it will be a fully independent UK trademark that can be challenged, assigned, licensed, or renewed separately from your original EU trademark, which is still sitting there on the EU register. Now, you won't need to pay for your equivalent comparable UK trademark. There is no fee for transition, and you won't receive a trademark certificate. You will be able to access the details, though, about the trademark online at the IPO site. There's a couple of points worth bearing in mind for existing EU trademarks. So for UK marks which are cloned from an EU application, there'll be 9 months to pay the official filing fees. No extensions are going to be granted, so do bear that in mind. Even if the EU mark is almost registered, so you're in the final stages, but you don't quite get over the line by the 1st of January, I'm afraid your UK claimed mark will go back to the start of the application process. Which brings me on to new applications. So UK businesses can still apply. You can still apply for an EU trademark before the 1st of January 2021. But if you have an EU trademark that is still pending on the 1st of January, you'll need to apply. The EU trademark application will continue in the EU IPO, but you'll need to apply to register a comparable UK trademark in the 9 months after 1st of January 2021. That mark will still retain the earlier filing date of the pending EU trademark, and it can claim any valid international priority or seniority that you'd already recorded, but it will have to start again. In terms of new EU trademark applications, they are taking around, I think the last discussion I had was around 6 months to process to registration. So you can work out, if you put an application in now, you're not going to get it through before the January deadline. So when you need to think about that, if you are in that position, what we're seeing is that clients are now, and have been for a little while, when they do apply for an EU trademark, they're applying for a UK one at the same time. Some other impacts, so for a national trademark, we have an uninterrupted period of 5 years non-use in the UK that can render a mark vulnerable to challenge. Now, the UK government has stated that applying that approach to the cloned UK trademarks could cause a problem, because many of them will correspond to EU trademarks that have never been used in the UK. And that would mean that they didn't have the requisite protection. So the new requirements ensure that any use in the EU made before the 1st of January 2021, whether inside or outside the UK, will count as use of the cloned UK right. So your last use of a UK cloned right will be the last use in or outside the EU or the UK before 1 January 2021. Use in the EU after the 1st of January 2021 will not count for the purposes of use of the UK claimed mark. Only use in the UK will count. I hope that's clear. And it's a similar position on the question of reputation. So reputation, obviously for some marks, may have been built up in the EU, but not necessarily in the UK. But again, it will be considered, the EU use will be considered in the UK for those purposes, so that you'll be applying a similar approach. Now, if you're in a position though where you've not used the UK mark, and there's a reason for that, you haven't got a market really in the UK for a particular brand, or you're not using it, you can opt out of holding the cloned mark. And if you do, the cloned right will be treated as if it had never been applied for or registered under UK law. Now, that notice of opt-out can only be given after the 1st of January 2021, and a notice template is going to be made available for opt-out requests. So there's nothing you can do about that quite yet, but that will come up.
Is there any particular reason why people might want to opt out as opposed to just letting it sit there and expiring at the next renewal?
Well, I suppose, cost-wise, you're not really incurring anything. So you could just let it sit there and see how it goes. But for some clients, it's a case that, you know, they like to keep their portfolio nice and tight and sorted, and while it's in their minds. I think some also don't want to be in a position where it just creeps through. Many of us who've worked on trademark portfolios, and you come to do an audit, and there are marks on there that you didn't even know your company owned, but they've just slipped through and been automatically renewed. You know, somebody's just, they're on the list, so they're paid for. So I think it's more of a timing thing than anything else.
I suppose if people are prompted by Brexit as an opportunity to have a look at their portfolio overall, and they may already have an equivalent UK mark that may even predate it, they may not need the duplicate, and if doing it in one go, they're less likely to let them slip through. Absolutely. Yeah. What about trademark licenses? Is there any impact on existing licenses?
Yeah, we've had this discussion quite a bit, particularly with our kind of commercial contract colleagues as well. So if you've got a license or an agreement that refers to the territory as the EU, then it's recommended that I think you put in place an addendum which clarifies whether the intention is for the EU definition to be both the UK and the EU, or the EU alone post-Brexit. That's quite a simple thing to do. Similarly, if you've got licenses or settlements that refer to EU trademarks, it's worth clarifying whether or not they should be interpreted as referring to both the EU trademark and the cloned UK right post-Brexit. Obviously under contract interpretation, looking at the date the contract was made, the definitions as they stand. If you want clarity on that, we're recommending it's worth doing that, because it's a relatively simple thing to put in place. I think the other thing to consider as well is that in terms of any licenses or interests you have registered against your EU trademarks, when the UK cloned mark moves across, those interests will not move across as well. So you will need to file any licenses or any registered interests. You will have to file them again in the UK.
It's important that people remember to do that. Our experience is actually a lot of clients forget to do that anyway. So maybe yes, this is their opportunity to sort it out now, because obviously there are impacts, especially when you're looking at things like litigation, if you don't register it. I'm conscious we said 45 minutes before we went to questions, so we've just got one last section I'd quite like to ask you about before we open it up to questions, and that's just to summarise this section really, but also probably the whole thing. What would you consider to be the key considerations for in-house counsel to be thinking about when they're worrying about their UK protection?
So at the moment, it is very Brexit dominated inevitably. So looking at whether there will be any duplication, as you rightly mentioned, John, on the register. If so, do they want to opt out of any rights to avoid that? Are there any EU rights which have not been used in the UK to date? It's worth reflecting on that. So although you've got this 5 years, it's worth thinking about, well, actually, is there a reason why we've not used this right in the UK all these years? Has it just been a defensive had a defensive purpose, or is actually there a genuine reason we just don't use it? The brand has no relevance to the UK. Do you have any EU trademark applications that will be pending on the 1st of January 2021? And if you do you need to be getting on and getting a new UK application in? Check with your agents that obviously they have the necessary EU representation rights. I'm sure they do. They put a lot of work in, the attorneys, to make sure they're all ready for this. And again, you know, speak to your attorneys about your portfolio. Check in with them on are there any issues on duplication? Are there any issues on use? Also, make sure that you're clear on what the filing policy is going to be going forward. So are you going to apply automatically for a UK right every time you apply for an EU right? Is that going to be just a matter of course, or are you not? How are you going to approach it? And that final point, just to reiterate, because John, you're absolutely right, it is really important. If you do have licenses or securities registered against your EU TNs, please make those recordals against your UK claimed rights. It's something I know both you and I have seen time and time again, where we've got to an important stage of litigation and that has not been done.
Exactly. Thank you, Kate. I know this was billed as a 45-minute webinar, so if you have to leave us now, thank you for coming. But for those of you who can stay around and wish to ask any questions, please do fill them in now. I know we've had a few questions as we've been going along, which we've fed into the discussion we've been having. But if you've got any questions, please do send them through now. I'll give you a moment to do that. We've got one while we wait to see if any more arrive, Kate. That's about exhaustion of rights. We haven't really talked about it in the context of Brexit, and I'm conscious that it is almost a topic in its own right. So yes, we'll probably have to do it briefly. But where are we with exhaustion of rights in the Brexit?
So we're in a bit of a holding position on that. So at the moment, the UK government is saying that it will still respect the and guard the EU position as a territory in terms of regional exhaustion. So at the moment, the UK is saying that from our side, we will treat goods as exhausted within the EU. The longer term solution is not clear. I think if you asked most practitioners, their guess would be that we will end up adopting an international exhaustion regime. It's difficult to see how in the long term we could continue with regional exhaustion in circumstances where we are no longer a member of the EU. And certainly the word on the trade discussions to date doesn't seem to indicate that we're going to move towards any possibility of regional. National exhaustion, I think, would raise a lot of issues consumer-wise. So I think by process of elimination, the suspicion is we will in the long term probably move towards international exhaustion. In terms of the EU at the moment is staying silent on the subject. There are a few discussions, but they are still to indicate clearly what the position will be, because of course it is all tied up with trade, and that's exactly what's being discussed at the moment. So I imagine it's one of those things that probably in a year's time, John, everybody will be sick of us giving webinars about international exhaustion and parallel trade and talking about it as we get some more clarity.
Well, let's hope they're not already fed up with it.
No, fed up with Brexit? How can anybody be fed up with Brexit?
No, exactly. Well, listen.
That was, by the way, ironic.
Yeah, I'm sure. A bit like some of the Trump team statements.
Yes.
We haven't got any more questions. Oh, hang on. Let me just double check something. Nope, that is it. Sorry, I thought somebody put their hand up, which I didn't know quite how to deal with. If you did, I apologise. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you everybody who's tuned in to listen to us ramble about all things brand. Just a quick reminder about that feedback form again. Please do fill it in, because we do want to hear from you about what you'd like us to cover next time. And as part of this series, the next one in the series is with me, and it's about designs, and it's at 10:30 in the morning on Thursday the 3rd of December, followed by the final webinar of this series, which is on copyright, which is on the 19th of January. And also, just a quick plug, don't miss the other series of webinars that Gowling WLG is organising about brands and so on at the moment, which is called the Life Cycle of a Smart Idea series, which is more international in focus. And the next one in that series is on the 2nd of December, and it's about anti-counterfeiting. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us on this cold and slightly wintry day, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.